Corning is playing in this industry as a supplier of catalytic converter components. So the battery electric vehicle does not require a catalytic converter, so it brings a lot of interest to our board of directors on where this is going. My job at Corning for the last 20 years has been to follow the trends in emissions of vehicles. This involves regulatory, engines, fuels, emission control technology, health studies, which drive all the regulations. And lately, I've been migrating into the battery electric vehicle. So I bring with me a perspective on the ICE and on the battery electric vehicle that's still being formulated. So just like Mariana, I have to give a full disclosure. You know, the battery electric vehicle might not be in the best interest of my division at Corning, but it is in the interest of perhaps of the company as a whole. We are developing products for the battery electric vehicle. I have a presentation here that has a lot of information in it. I'm going to go through it very quickly. If the presentations are going to be made available to the audience, this one will be made in its entirety. So the other tip I'll give you is just pay attention to the title of the slide if you want, and all the background information on the slide supports that summary in the title. I like to tell you what I'm going to be telling you, then tell you, and then summarize what I just told you. Regulations are driving the battery electric vehicle market, to be sure, right now. And China and California are the only ones with mandates in this regard. But this could be an obsolete statement in a few months, as the EPA has is proposing to remove the mandate on California, and Europe is proposing a mandate similar to the Chinese. I'll explain that more. Internal combustion engines are still very rapidly developing. I'll show you a list of technologies, and we might be able to achieve 50% reduction in the CO2 level of today's vehicles with full implementation of those technologies. But battery electric vehicles are the future, and the uncertainty is the timing and how fast and how great. It is becoming difficult to invest in ICE technology as the batteries improve. And this is in line with what Mariana just said. If there is an overestimate in the battery penetration or market interest, it could have a significant impact on ICE investment. And we're seeing that already with many of the announcements from the auto companies. So we've got a chicken-egg development here, and that could, by default, make the internal combustion engine investments less aggressive than might be needed otherwise. Charging, in my opinion, remains the critical component to battery electric vehicle penetration. It is turning profitable. It's not profitable today. Fast or passive charging is likely needed to reach the 50 to 70% of the commuting market. That is, those people that don't have access to chargers in their apartments or at work. So can you imagine taking an hour out of your weekend to go charge your car? That would be the prognosis if you don't have access to charging. So fast charging, I think, is very critical. On the other hand, it's possible today to put a charging pad into your garage at home. You drive your car over it, and you don't even have to plug it in. Now, that makes it more convenient than the gasoline cars that we drive today. So charging is a benefit and a liability, in my opinion, on the battery electric vehicle. Battery electric vehicle worldwide sales are up 70% from 2017, and China has doubled. So this is a rapidly growing market, and we'll pay attention. This is a summary for you of the mandates. The most significant one is China, followed by the proposal in Europe. China's mandating about a 20% penetration of electric vehicles in 2025. This is still a proposal, and they're looking at upwards of 40% in 2030. To hit that 20% mandate in 2025, they're going to have to grow the battery electric vehicle market at only 20% a year. They are doubling from 2016, so it looks like they're well on the pathway to doing that. The California mandate is equivalent to about a 2.3% mandate nationwide, and that one's being threatened today. Europe, on the other hand, is moving forward in a proposal anyway, with a mandate very similar to the Chinese mandate. This is an interesting chart. I think you all know it intuitively, but it's a good way to describe the balancing act that the auto companies have to play in meeting these mandates. The fulcrum represents the CO2 regulation. Going from left to right is the CO2 reductions, 100% reductions on the right-hand side, less on the left-hand side, and the volume of vehicles is on the y-axis, which each bar representing a vehicle type. Notice that from the top chart to the bottom chart, the fulcrum moves to the right. This is a tightening CO2 regulation. And each of those bars also moves because the efficiency will improve on each of these platforms. But one can see, to balance the fulcrum, the lever today, very few battery electric vehicles are needed. Way on the right-hand side, you can just see a little blip. However, going into the future, we can see those bars growing significantly and the other ones decreasing. So there's a number of ways to meet the regulation just by changing the size of the bar and where they sit on this lever. And that all depends on the auto company strategy. What is their market? What is their capability? And where do they see the future going? This is a chart for you. I'm not going to go through this at all, except just to say that there's a lot of technologies here that the auto companies can leverage to meet the emerging CO2 regulations and fuel economy regulations. Electrification is on the bottom of the table, and these are generally additive in some way to the technologies on the top. Going from the top to bottom, in that first part of the chart is the maturity of the technologies. Those on the bottom, where you see that red, are emerging. They're still research or early development technologies. And I'd like to say one thing regarding this chart, and that is that those technologies are competing with batteries. So as the batteries develop more and more rapidly, these technologies become more and more threatened. So my advice to the engine researchers in the audience is that if you don't hurry up and get those red technologies moving and into the market by 2025, you're probably never going to make it into the market, at least in the light-duty sector. So that's very important to understand. Furthermore, the more electrification we put on the vehicle, the less important the engine becomes. So you can put a lawnmower engine on a range-extending vehicle, and it won't have hardly any impact on the CO2 footprint of the vehicle in the whole realm of things. There's all kinds of market projections. I like to put this one up because it's based on IHS of a year ago. And they're showing battery electric vehicles having a relatively minor penetration over the next 7 or 8 years. But hybridization is taking off. The battery electric vehicle penetration shown here is probably, 5%? I think these are increasing year on year. So maybe IHS's latest projection might be 10%. So that's another highlight that I'd like to show here. Teardown studies are being done on battery electric vehicles, and the bar chart on the left shows the Chevy Bolt. The one in the same chart on the right shows the Golf. And there is a gap there, but the middle bar represents the 2025 estimate of the Chevy Bolt, and you can see that they're coming close to parity. Keep in mind that VW Golf will have to increase in price to meet the emerging CO2 fuel economy regulations. So those bars are going to meet. The upper right-hand quote is coming from General Motors in a panel discussion here at the University of Michigan, where they said quite provocatively that they are projecting that in 2025, the battery electric vehicle cost to General Motors will be at parity with a similar ICE vehicle. And that sent rumbles through the audience. Denso was even more aggressive. They said 2023. And the total cost of driving the car is much less for the battery electric vehicle. And the chart on the left is a total cost of ownership for each model year going forward, with the solid bars on the bottom, level bars on the bottom being ICE based, and the dark bar going through the center of the chart being battery electric vehicle, showing total cost of 5-year ownership at parity in roughly 2026. So there's a number of these studies that are emerging. Some preliminary observations. Battery technology is evolving very fast. It's unbelievable how fast it's going. I might see one paper at a conference now on an emerging battery technology, and the next conference a year later will have a whole session on that technology. Thousands of people in the room. You go to an engine conference and there might be 300 or 400. And that it was always that way. So it's really unbelievable how fast it's evolving. Half of the households don't have a battery charging access at home or at work. Fast charging is needed. These cost $225,000 for a 3-point station, and the cost of the energy at these stations is more expensive than gasoline in general. So it kind of takes away the motivation. And my hypothesis is that charging needs to be an asset rather than a liability. And I gave the example earlier of that pad on the bottom of on the floor of my garage that will charge my vehicle without me even knowing it. Wireless is the way to go, in my opinion. It's emerging already. Wireless charging, that is. It's already emerging in the bus market. That black chart in the center shows the yellow bar where the vehicle's charged during the rest stop for the driver, 10 minutes an hour or 15 minutes an hour. And the blue bar, the blue line in that chart represents the status quo. You get more range out of it, so you can drop the battery loading. You can't see it very well, but in the lower right-hand corner, New York City is taking on a pilot program on wireless charging, putting these pads in locations where people park for 10 minutes. You know, you can go in for a cup of coffee or something to grab quick groceries or whatever. You park over a pad and it happens without you even knowing it. And of course, long-term, putting these strips into the highway. Now, all of this is investment, and if the governments are really serious about it, this is the way to go. Finally, we heard earlier from Mariana that the cost was estimated by some organizations to be $3 trillion. Much of that is in the grid. This just shows the energy consumption versus hour. If we have 100% battery electric vehicle penetration, to my surprise, the power generating capacity only has to go up 16%. 100% BEVs, 16% power generation capacity. Truly, it's really the grid and everything else. The lower left-hand chart, or the middle chart, on the right-hand side is the 20/80 rule. It takes about 20 years for a vehicle technology to reach 80% market share after the initial introduction. So we're certainly dealing with a conservative marketplace, a conservative industry. This may be changing. But the chart in the lower left-hand corner is a blow-up of this one, showing fuel-efficient technologies. And there's one bar there that really goes up rapidly. And this is gasoline direct injection technology. And the reason that it goes up rapidly is that this is adding to the vehicle. It's adding benefit to the vehicle. It makes it more fun to drive. And if you talk to anybody that owns a battery electric vehicle, that's what they tell you. It's a great vehicle to drive. So that's the big question, in my opinion, is what will be the market acceptance of the battery electric vehicle, looking at all the assets like fun to drive and all the liability like charging or battery degradation or other things. So we can look at mandates, we can do all this projection, but what I'd like to see is I'd like to see market studies on what customers are willing to buy. Blind studies on not the vehicle type, but the characteristics of that vehicle and what it might mean to your purchase decision. So I think that's the bottleneck. That's the issue that we need to fill to look at battery electric vehicle penetration. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and the discussions.